early 1950s to the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The civil rights struggle was about dissolving the racism iceberg. It was about challenging the status quo of racial segregation and reframing the issue of race to a new level of understanding that all human beings are created in the image of God. Thus, black people began believing that they were somebody. They began believing and feeling that they were equal and had a right to all the basic human dignity and freedoms in civil society. It was through this struggle that I became the person that I am today. During the sit-in demonstrations in the summer of 1960, I made that commitment to nonviolence, which meant that I would sit in white public accommodations and refuse to leave. I was willing to be arrested and go to jail to protest the immoral and unjust laws of separate but equal. I was arrested and spent jail time in the same cell with Dr. King. Now, those hours with Dr. King changed my life. I became convinced that Gandhi's concept of soul force, love, was the greatest resource for bringing about change in the world. And Dr. King challenged us to let love be the motivating influence in our lives. He reminded us that Jesus was all about love. Love your enemies. Love your neighbor. Do good to those who mistreat you. Turn the other cheek. Now, throughout my ministry, when faced with challenging or difficult issues or decisions, I inevitably found myself being reminded of my commitment to nonviolence and to the encounter with Dr. King. When we as angry black radicals expressed our hate of white people, I shall never forget how Dr. King kept reminding us that Bull Connors and George Wallace were our brothers. On one occasion, he looked at me and said, "Melvin Talbert, you know better because George Wallace is a Methodist." I have frequently stated that Dr. King was the greatest ally white America ever had, even though publicly he was excoriated, criticized, and rejected. But he was the greatest ally that white America ever had because he refused to embrace the rhetoric of hate espoused by some black leaders. So I stand before you tonight and I declare boldly that all of you are my sisters and brothers. We're members of the one family, the human family, the family of God. I further declare that racism is a sin against God and humanity. Racism is an evil that must be identified, addressed, and eradicated from our community. However, our most recent presidential election is a reminder that racism is still alive and well in every aspect of our society. The unfinished task and challenge of eradicating racism is still before us. But my experience of racism suggests that there are other icebergs afloat in the sea of humanity and deserve some in-depth exploration in our churches and in society. Two of these icebergs are heterosexism and sexism. First, the iceberg of heterosexism. As a matter of personal confession, I am not gay. I'm straight. So I have some deep reservations regarding my effort to share perspectives on what it's like to be a person of a different sexual orientation or gender identity. But I have known oppression. So I do claim my capacity to empathize and to proclaim what I understand to be God's truth of who we are as human beings. Without exception, we are each part of God's family. As heterosexuals of every race and culture, we have our prejudices and biases regarding persons with different sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm sure that persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity have their prejudices and biases regarding heterosexuality. But like racism, heterosexism is not the same as heterosexual prejudice. Heterosexism is heterosexual prejudice plus power. It is the misuse of heterosexual systemic power. And my contention is that we as heterosexuals must explore the depth of heterosexism for the purpose of intentionally taking steps to rid ourselves of the sin of heterosexism that plagues us as a church and as society. Now, using the iceberg analogy, heterosexism has three primary manifestations: individual, institutional, systemic. And likewise, each of these manifestations have three levels: oppressive power, heterosexual power, and identity power. The oppressive power of heterosexism is the visible acts or expressions that hurt persons of a different sexual orientation or gender identity and denies them their basic human rights and full access to all benefits and privileges. And some examples of oppressive power of heterosexism are, number one, the killing of Matthew Shepard. That's individual manifestation. The United Methodist Church enshrining incompatibility language in its Book of Discipline. That's institutional manifestation. And churches and other groups coercing gay and lesbian persons to go through brainwashing processes to enable them to become heterosexual. That's systemic manifestation. Now, of course, heterosexual power is the core of heterosexism. This is the place where heterosexism's purpose resides. Heterosexism is not really about hurting persons of a different sexual orientation or gender identity. It is about giving privilege and power to the heterosexuals. Now, within the system of heterosexism, heterosexual people are superior. The things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power level, happen because of the core. Some examples of heterosexual power are characterizing all gay persons as immoral. That's individual. Churches not ordaining persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity. That's institutional. Only heterosexual lifestyles portrayed in church literature or magazines. That's systemic. Now, identity power is the base of the iceberg. It is the most damaging level of heterosexuality. It is heterosexism claiming the power to tell heterosexual persons and persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity who they are. Heterosexism attempts to usurp the authority of God. It is at the identity power level that heterosexism begins to shape us and to tell us what to think and what to feel about ourselves. Some examples of identity power are heterosexuals proclaiming they are not prejudiced, but simply doing what is just and right by condemning the lifestyles of persons with different sexual orientation and gender identities. That's an individual manifestation. Involving or using persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity to overtly oppose the full inclusion of persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity in churches or in society. That's institutional manifestation. And corporations or churches refusing to portray persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity in society in a positive manner. That's systemic manifestation. Now, in the midst of the 1970s, while serving as General Secretary of the newly created General Board of Discipleship, I accept the invitation to participate in a very special event and engagement in an interaction in Boston, here in Boston, Massachusetts. Participants were told in advance that the group of 30 or more would be a mixture of gay and straight, persons from various sectors of society. The event began Friday evening with dinner and ended with lunch on Sunday. The covenant was to share only our name and the place from which we came. We were not to reveal our vocation or sexual identity until the final session on Sunday morning. Needless to say, at that time, I was homophobic. I brought with me to this occasion all of my biases and stereotypes regarding people who were homosexuals. So throughout that experience, even though we were told to simply engage the process, I decided that I could pick them out. I knew who they were by my own biases and prejudices. But when we were invited to participate and to share our sexual identity and vocations on Sunday morning, I was blown away. All of my stereotypes were shattered. And that day, I made a commitment to God and my soul that I would never again discriminate against another person because of their sexual orientation. And that was the beginning of my journey to who I am today. Out of my own experience, I've come to the realization that homosexuals and heterosexuals are persons of sacred worth and must be granted their full human and civil rights. So I declare to you this day that persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity are members of the family of God, and heterosexuals have no legal or theological grounds on which to declare otherwise. Heterosexism is a sin and an evil that must be identified, confronted, and eradicated from the community. And like racism, heterosexism is an iceberg afloat in our relationships that's in need of thawing and melting so that our rights and privileges can be shared equally and freely as members of the family of God. And now the third iceberg, third iceberg afloat in our sea of relationship is sexism. I was born and raised in a male-dominated society. That was true in every aspect of my community, the church, the government, the schools, etc. Irrespective of the intellect and competence of women, men had the right and the privilege to prescribe certain roles for women. And that was true for men of every race and culture. And may I suggest that the same held true for men who were part of the gay community. In reality, men of all races and all different sexual orientation or gender identities have prejudices and biases toward women, just as women have biases and prejudices toward men. But sexism is not the same as sexist prejudice. Sexism is sexist prejudice plus power. It is the misuse of sexist systemic power. And my contention is that men with the historic weight of tradition and culture and religion on their side must be open to exploring the depths of our sexism so that the purpose of sexism for the purpose of intentionally taking steps to rid ourselves of the sin and evil of sexism that plagues the church and society. Again, using the iceberg analogy, sexism has three primary manifestations: individual, institutional, and systemic. Likewise, each of these manifestations has three levels: oppressive power, sexist power, and identity power. The oppressive power of sexism is what we see. It is the visible acts or expressions that hurt women of all races or different sexual orientation and gender identity, and deny them their basic human rights and full access to benefits and privileges. For some reason, men tend to justify their acts of injustice and discrimination against women. An example of the oppressive power of sexism is a district superintendent reporting to a bishop that a congregation does not want a woman pastor appointed to the congregation, or a corporation or institution continuing to sustain the invisible glass ceiling that never allow women to break through. A classic example is the most recent selection of leadership for the committees of the U.S. Congress. I want you to watch the next picture that you see. When the speaker comes out, he will have the lone woman walking with him, but right behind him is a long trail of white men. Sexist power is the core of sexism. It is where sexism's purpose resides, because sexism is not really about hurting women. It's about giving privilege and power to men. Within the system of sexism, men are superior to women. The things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power, happen because of the core. Now, while serving as an active bishop, some district superintendents reported to me that churches did not want a woman pastor. And of course, those reports were not the final word. The cabinet and I had a strategy for dealing with such reports. First, the cabinet and I were clear that we would not tolerate discrimination against women. Even though we expected open and honest sharing from the churches, we made it clear that our decision-making process would not be determined by the reports from the churches. Rather, if the bishop and the cabinet concluded that the person possessing the gifts and graces for leading their congregation was a woman, their request for not receiving a woman would not be considered until after they had a consultation with the person we had selected as the best possible choice for that congregation. I'm pleased to report that my cabinet and I never lost a battle. For you see, once people come face to face with the unknown that is another human being, something magical happens. The human dynamic of love and justice and grace turn fear into redemptive action. Identity power is the base of the iceberg. It is the most damaging level of sexism. It is men claiming the power to tell women and other men who they are. Sexism attempts to usurp the authority of God. And it is at the identity power level that sexism shapes men and women and tells us what we think and how we feel about ourselves. And some examples of identity power are men proclaiming they are not prejudiced against women, but they are simply claiming their God-given right to be men. Individual manifestation. Involving and using women to overtly oppose the full inclusion of women in churches and other institutions in society. Institutional manifestation. And churches and other institutions refusing to portray women in a positive manner in all levels of leadership in church and in society. Systemic manifestation. Like racism and heterosexism, sexism is an iceberg afloat in the sea of our human experiences in every aspect of our society. It is an evil and a sin against humanity. It must be identified, confronted, and eradicated so that our human relationships can flourish without serious interruptions. So in conclusion, I'm deeply indebted to the authors of the book Set Free, A Journey Toward Solidarity Against Racism. Too often, we find ourselves dealing with symptoms. The iceberg concept suggests that in human relations, greater efforts should be placed on probing the depths to explore a broader understanding of what causes us to do things and to do the things that we do to each other. During this week of remembering the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we hold before us his vision for a beloved community. It is my contention that the beloved community cannot be realized without focusing attention on the loaded icebergs of racism, heterosexism, and sexism afloat in our midst. Now, in this lecture, I have presented 3 distinct cases for issues which lead to the intersection of oppression and privilege. I have not said anything about power. It is my experience that power has been both enabling and controlling. It has been abusive and empowering. Yet, in each of the 3 cases I used in this session are abuse, are issues are used in an abusive manner. In each of these cases, power has become corrupt. Quoting the English philosopher Edmund Burke, Dr. King frequently said, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men, and I say good people, to do nothing." Now, my sisters and brothers, from the beginning, evil existed in the world, And you and I know that there's a lot of evil lurking in our lives today. And as people of faith, we are called by God to be part of the force for good in the world so that evil will not triumph. And it is my prayer that God's Spirit will prod us into being active agents for the common good of all creation. May we use all of our resources, all of our power to eradicate the sin and evil of racism, heterosexism, and sexism from all of our relationships in society, and especially in the church. Thank you.